If you're curious about the impact of subways and other metro lines on the development and urbanization of America, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be covering The Lost Subways of North America by Jacob Berman. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we are covering a book that came out just last year by Jacob Berman, which deals with the subway systems that have been built all throughout America and Canada over the last century plus. Now, the name is a little bit of a misnomer. It says the lost subways. There are some subway systems that it covers being built or being put into action, like I think it's Cincinnati, where most of the subway gets built, but then just for one reason or another, it doesn't ever get finished. And so they, to this day, have parts of an unfinished subway. Or Rochester, New York has a subway system that it builds and then eventually does away with it. They decide that they no longer want to have a subway system. But the book actually deals with much more than just subway systems. It really deals with any kind of light rail to, I guess, moderate sized rail. The first thing he does is he tries to describe all the different types of rails that are used when it comes to transportations within a city. You're talking monorails, light rails, subways. He goes over all of them. To say it's only about subways would be a little misleading. On top of that, he says lost subways. He deals with a lot of cities that very much have subway systems that are completely in use and in some cases are actually quite popular within their cities. So it's a little misleading to say that it's about lost subways. Although that is a part of the book, it's by no means the whole part of the book. Matter of fact, I wouldn't even say it's a majority of the book. Really, at the heart of this book is his efforts at trying to show the challenges, the benefits, the disadvantages, and everything in between about building different systems for different cities. And that, of course, means questions of equality, equal opportunities, the consequences of building metro systems, what happens when you put them in, who does that benefit, whether that's the suburbs or whether that's people that are living within the city, or whether it leads to people leaving the city and going to the suburbs, or whether it's questions of a system that gets built that's incredibly expensive, but it just turns into essentially a boondoggle because it just never really gets used. So he addresses all of those different things in this book. And so he uses different cities as examples. Like I said, Cincinnati, he uses an example where they started to build a subway system and then it gets stopped because there's a variety of reasons, almost all of them dealing with politics that prevent it from being finished. And when it comes to funding, almost all these projects are more expensive than anyone had originally proposed. On top of that, you will almost always have fierce opposition to any kind of major rail infrastructure being built, especially within a city. And so he just does it city by city. Now, he early on says that he's only going to look at North America. Even then, that only includes a couple cities in Canada. So he does talk about Vancouver. He talks a little bit about Toronto, not a ton, and then Montreal. Those are the three Canadian cities. And then he looks at a whole bunch of American cities. He does not look at any cities in Mexico. And he says that's because just the history and the development of them is so dramatically different from those in Canada and the United States that he doesn't feel like it could be part of this book very easily. I think it was the one in Cincinnati that sent him off on this quest where he discovered that there had been efforts to build the subway system and that parts of it were still there. But it then led him into looking at a whole bunch of other cities. Cities he had assumed had never had any kind of rail in them, including trolley cars or anything like that. He quickly discovered that a lot of cities have had different rail systems throughout their history than he had originally realized. This is just a personal example. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, Virginia is actually one of the first places to get a trolley line. And it was quite successful. And you can go look up maps that show where it extends quite a bit. And it is one of the things that helped facilitate people moving farther out into the suburbs. It's one of the things that helped to create the suburbs of Richmond. And that's not uncommon. But with time, that system just becomes less utilized. It's kind of expensive. And eventually you'll see the whole trolley system be swapped out. And instead, bus systems will come in, which he discusses in a little bit of detail. He doesn't get into too much of the nitty gritty about what it takes to run a bus system, but he does make the point that they tend to be, especially if you have dedicated bus lanes, they're given right away, their own stop lights and stuff, then they tend to be cheaper and more effective, but they're just not as popular. It's just harder to get a population of a city excited about building more access for buses instead of getting them much more interested in the far more expensive, far more costly, far more complicated and far more politically taxing efforts of building any kind of rail system within the city or leading into the city. At the heart of this book is a lot of discussions of opportunity, because that is why you would build a rail system, right? Opportunity within the city to have people to go from one side of the city to the other much more quickly. Also opportunity for people that are not living in the city to either come into the city or to leave the city. All of these are reasons why people would want a rail system within their city. Underlining that is, who do you want to give opportunities to? And so that raises lots of questions, politically speaking, lots of questions when it comes to race and class. And that is a big part of the book, is exploring when any kind of attempt at building a system gets undermined by issues of race or issues of political deadlock that are also very frequently connected to racial tensions within a city. And one of the big things you'll see when it comes to funding and supporting rail systems is how often a shift in demographics, especially within cities, when you have white flight in the 50s and 60s and 70s, how that suddenly changes what a voting tax base is willing to pay for, and how that can be one of the biggest troubles with building these systems. And it's one of the things that leads to many of these systems being not particularly popular. To this day, there are some major American cities that do have light rail, but they're just not used for one reason or another. And he outlines what some of those reasons are. If you go to Dallas, it has a light rail system, but none of the stations are anywhere near any important location. It doesn't even have a real stop in the downtown of Dallas, which there is a very much established area in Dallas that you could stop and walk around and see lots of things and do lots of things, go to museums. Yet there is no metro stop or whatever the DART, whatever their train system is, that stops down there. And so it completely undermines the purpose of even having that. On top of that, questions of zoning, especially when it comes to building up around metro stops. The one example he points of that is a good opposite to that would be in the DC area. The DC metro system is really tricky to build for a lot of reasons. It is not just in DC, it extends into Maryland and into the northern suburbs of Virginia, which means that you are dealing with a lot of different political entities. On top of that, the city of DC, up until relatively recently, was actually literally run by the federal government. They didn't have any control over their own purse or any decision making when it came to big projects like this. And so it made it a challenge to get it done. But fortunately for the DC Metro, they did make it a point of redoing the zoning so that wherever metro stations went in, you could also build up and you could have a much more densely packed area, which means that the DC Metro system and the greater DC area is one of your few metro systems that is not only extensive and functional, but that was built in a post World War II society, more or less. If you look at any of your other cities that have very functional metro systems like Chicago or Boston or New York, all of these are cities that existed well before the car. Therefore, it stands to reason that the metro system there would be more effort in building metro systems. DC is unique in that it really does not come into its own until after World War II, and so it's kind of surprising that it has such a successful metro system. That being said, it still has its problems. It talks about several instances where underfunding caused major delays and major issues, but compared to a lot of other big cities, it's far more successful. So who would I say this book is for? I mean, anyone that is interested in infrastructure and what it takes to build something like light rail. Of course, this is one element of building up a city, I would say a pretty important element, but it's by no means the only element. And so this is one thing you could explore among many when it comes to urbanization and urban development. Of course, if you're interested in railroads themselves or railways, even though these are all light rails, this could very much be appealing to you as well. I know that there's a lot of people out there that are very interested in building model train sets, but also they just have an interest in the railroads of America. And I think that this is an interesting subsection of that, to look at the light rail and the way that it interacts with the larger population and politics. I would say this book is for anyone that's curious about the challenges that it takes not to just build light rail, but just the challenges that it takes to build a city, generally speaking, and all the things that you probably think of when it comes to resources, how land is going to be allocated and used, but then also things that you may not be considering. I think this is one of the, I think this is a really good way to consider, such as zoning, and again, questions of racial distribution and the impact that that'll have. Overall, I would recommend this book to almost anyone that has questions of just struggles that we face in an industrialized world, and the questions of trying to balance everyone's interests. I think it's an incredibly well written book. From beginning to end, I had no problem reading it. I was never bored. I thought that it was the way he wrote was very engaging, and it is something that I would encourage anyone that just has any kind of curiosity about the interplay of politics, infrastructure, and building our cities. Who wouldn't I say this is for? Well, if you don't think that you're going to find the struggles that it takes to build any kind of light rail system, or the consequences of building or not building a light rail system, then this probably isn't going to be for you. Like I said, there's also a lot of questions about social and racial equality, and if that's not something that you're interested in engaging with, then this probably isn't going to be for you either. I would strongly recommend anyone that thinks they have an inkling of this type of subject, or somebody that thinks that they could be pleasantly surprised about how fascinating they find a topic like this once they get into it. I would recommend it for anyone like that. It's not a very long book. Like I said, I found it pretty engrossing from beginning to end. But if you've read this, please let me know if you have a difference of opinion. Please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.